When I was much younger, about 400 years ago now, there didn't seem to be the range of hobby and gaming stores available that there are now. If I wanted acrylic paint designed especially for miniatures, there was only one choice as far as I can recall, a big name brand in the miniature hobby of which some of you may have heard. I also remember some horrific paint jobs involving the use of enamel paints, but don't make me go back there. It was a long time before I came across any other brand of acrylic miniature paint, and looking back I think that was probably a good thing. There are so many choices available to the new hobbyist these days that the choice of paint alone must be quite intimidating for someone on the outside looking in. This situation is not helped by the amount of marketing that is generally thrown at new brands of paint to the market, which can make every new bottle of paint seem like an unmissable treat. The reality, of course, is that there is much productivity to be gained just from understanding the properties of paint you already own, and applying them in situations that play to their strengths. In our Hydra video, I said, select a yellow from your own collection, and ideally one that you understand the properties of, so that you can adapt the amount that you use accordingly. But what do I really mean by that? Because, honestly, what could the difference be, right? Surely you just need the 7 colours of the rainbow, black, white and brown, and everything else is just a luxury. How have I ended up owning multiple pots of a similar colour from different paint brands? We talked about the variable consistency of paint in the second episode of this series, which you can find by clicking the box above. Some paints are thicker than others straight out of the pot, and this can make them more suitable for specific tasks. If I want to dry brush a miniature, I will usually turn to a thicker paint, whereas thinner paints will often be easier to put through an airbrush, but there are many other ways your paints can vary. In this video, we explore the value of becoming intimate with your paint collection, so that you can more easily select the right paint for the job at hand. There is one further tip, however, that we should probably discuss before we start. Most acrylic miniature paints are designed to be shaken, often thoroughly before use. Over time, the pigments and medium will tend to separate, and the longer between uses, the more energy that it will require to restore the intended consistency of the paint. If you've ever opened a bottle of paint expecting blue only to have a transparent goo emerge, then you know what I'm talking about. Even if the paint hasn't separated to this extent, you can get a distorted perception of a given paint if you do not take the time to sufficiently agitate them before use, as this will dramatically affect the opacity and sometimes even the colour and finish of a given paint. Miniature paints, like pretty much any type of paint, can vary in terms of their finish, which I guess is another way of saying how shiny or reflective of light the paint is once the paint is dried. Certain brands of miniature paint are heavily marketed for their matte or super matte qualities because when you are painting something on a very small scale, light reflections off the surface that you haven't intended can be a distraction from your paint job. This is a particular consideration for the photography and filming of miniatures, as some cameras struggle to deal with the sort of glare that can result from glossy paint. You might reasonably ask why all miniature paint isn't matte given its intended use, but there are good reasons for this not to be the case. Take for example a true metallic colour. As a general rule, the reflection you will get from metallic paint contributes to the impression that you are looking at metal. Often we will introduce other colours, including washes and inks, to a metallic base coat, and having these available in a gloss form can prevent your metallic colours from being dulled down by these techniques. It is worth knowing how your paints will reflect light when they dry, as this may affect which paint you use for which circumstance, but it is also worth knowing that these effects can be altered. If you routinely varnish your finished models, which I would certainly recommend if they are to be played with regularly, then you probably already know that applying a gloss varnish will make the model glossy, regardless of what paint you used for the colours. Likewise, matte varnish can dull the shiny elements of the model, and satin varnish will provide an effect that is slightly less shiny than gloss but still somewhat reflective. This creates some interesting opportunities. Using a gloss varnish on an area that is supposed to be wet or reflective, like glass, can create this effect even over a matte paint. For example, the waves I painted on the Andromeda model you saw in our resolutions video. Although all the paint used on the waves was matte, putting a water effect over the top, which acted in a very similar way to a thick gloss varnish, makes the water look, well, wetter. Conversely, one of my favourite inks is this sepia from Vallejo Model Inks. It has quite a glossy finish to it, as do a lot of the inks in this range from my experience. This makes it ideal for adding shadows to bronze armour without dulling the shine, but I will also use it on fabrics, safe in the knowledge that once I've applied a matte varnish, this shine will no longer exist. Knowing the finish of your paints is therefore only a starting point, but an important one. Will the paint you are choosing be affected by subsequent painting choices? Will it synergize with the other colours you have chosen? Another key way that paints differ is in their opacity. Paints can have very similar hues but still be very different in terms of the opacity of their paint. For example, if I take Vallejo game colour Scurvy Green and apply it neat to this sheet of palette paper, you can see I get a very opaque and rather thick coat that completely obscures the white of the paper. Looking at the bottles together, you'd probably expect scale colour Black Forest Green to be very similar, but when we perform the same test, we find that you can see some of the white of the paper through the scale colour paint. Does this make one of these paints better than the other? Absolutely not. If my objective is to apply a heavy base coat, then Scurvy Green is the paint for the job. However, Black Forest Green would be an excellent shade colour glazed thinly over other greens. Different tools for different jobs. It is also worth noting that what you are painting over and what the finished effect is you're aiming for will affect what opacity is best for you. Do you want a colour that will show the zenithal highlights through, for example, or are you trying to achieve full coverage over an area that has been painted black? Both may lead you to choose slightly different paints, even if the colour you are aiming for is similar. For this reason, judging paints by the colour they are in the bottle is tricky, and buying paint over the internet is even more so. It can be the case that similar paints from the same range will possess similar qualities. One of the reasons I tend towards using Vallejo paints is that I can usually rely on the sort of opacity and finish that they are likely to provide, and this is often in keeping with my personal painting style. However, this is rarely a reliable way of determining the opacity of paints. Considering the relative opacity of your paints when you decide on your paint scheme is a tremendously good idea, as it can make a big difference to the end result and your work time. However, it is worth adding that there are lots of factors that affect the opacity of the paint. As we have discussed previously, you will rarely use any paint without some amount of dilution, which immediately changes the opacity of the paint. By the time you start mixing paints with other colours, there are a host of possibilities how any given paint can be used. It's usually not the case that one brand is better than the other, but rather one may suit how you wish to paint in a given moment better than another. Being familiar with this aspect of your paints will simply help you make better decisions about what paint to use more quickly. This is probably quite an obvious thing to say, but sometimes the colour of a paint wet can be a little different to how it dries. This difference is normally pretty subtle in miniature paints, and certainly by the time paint is touching the model, you will usually have quite a good idea of what colour you will end up with. But even then, the shininess or finish of a paint will look quite different as it is being applied. The same applies when you look at paint while it is still in the bottle. Looking at a concentrated block of paint through a plastic filter, the paint will look slightly different to how it appears applied thinly over a model. This is why you'll see miniature painters applying a blob of the paint to the lid of their pots or noting down colour names next to a stripe of colour in sketch pads. It's a reminder of how the paint looks once it has dried. Lastly, the colour and intensity of the lighting under which you paint your model will affect your perception of the paint colours, and therefore the choices you make when selecting paints. If you was painted outside in the bright sunshine, you'd probably be able to achieve some very subtle colour transitions, but these transitions might not be visible at all in the artificial lights of your local hobby store. Personally, I try to paint under the same light that we film videos under and that I photograph models under to ensure consistency. I think there is an argument for painting under the sort of lighting you expect to do most of your gaming. So all these things being the case, how do you know what to buy when so many of the attributes of a paint can't be determined before you start to use it? This video is about getting familiar with the paints you already own, but what if you're just starting out? It's a fair question, so let me simplify it a little bit for those of you just looking to get started. First of all, we've already discussed how many of the properties of paint can be altered. If you have a very thick paint, it can be thinned. If you have a very gloss paint, there are ways of altering that property through the addition of mediums or varnishes, etc. Every paint has a place where it will be ideal, which you can learn to adjust a not ideal paint for a different role. My point is that being mindful of our paint and its properties, we can be smarter about our selection, and perhaps will avoid a lot of pain trying to adapt a paint to a role for which it is ill-suited when another paint in our collection might work better. Another great way of finding paints that may suit you is to look at the work of other painters. Even if you are painting a different model or using a different technique, colour matching to other work can be a good way to discover paints that are outside your usual range but useful. Most painters are quite willing to share the paints used to achieve a completed paint job, even if they don't want to reveal the exact combinations and ratios. This can be a great way to find new paint recommendations. For example, the reason I use Vallejo Moral Colour Deep Sea Blue in a lot of my schemes is that I saw this paint come up again and again in videos on YouTube, tutorials painters have posted online and so forth. Having tried it, I realised the reason for that. It's an interesting colour in its own right, but it's also an ideal shade and glaze colour in many circumstances. But honestly, there's no substitute for just trying things out. The joy of discovering a new favourite paint is well worth the dissatisfaction of the odd duff bottle in my experience, and a paint that might not be ideal for what you are working on right now might turn out to be perfect for a project further down the line. I would suggest, however, that you add new paints to your collection a bottle or two at a time, rather than jumping into purchasing a full paint line or a massive set of paints before you have tried a few paints from the range. If you have a favourite paint or paint combination, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you are new to the hobby, remember that these paints, and indeed our videos on the channel, are just recommendations to help you get started. In time, with patience, you will find your own rhythm and style of painting that works for you. Like all of us, you'll probably hit a few dead ends before you do, and that's okay. We're all on that journey together, some of us have just been walking a little longer. Until next time, work hard, play better, and take care out there.